2020 has been a crazy year all around, and the fantasy football world was definitely no exception. You know what I mean? If you were playing, trying to figure out who's going to help you win each week. Well, we're going to do our annual 2020 Fantasy Football Endgame MVP Award show, the first one ever. We're going to help decide who was the most valuable player in all of fantasy. And before we get to our first nominee, got to give some honorable mentions. Of course, there's so many players we could name. A guy like Dalvin Cook really helped get you at least to the playoffs, if not all the way to the ship. He didn't make our cut, and neither did Derrick Henry. I know he was a bell cow. You're not going to see any quarterbacks here. Josh Allen had a great year. Of course, Aaron Rodgers, Pat Mahomes. But we're going to narrow it down to our top three. So let's get to the very first nominee. Chris, we're starting, believe it or not, with a tight end. And I know you know this guy very well. Travis Kelce had a monster season, 1,416 yards, 11 touchdowns. Okay. Only one other tight end even got to 1,000 yards, and only one other tight end had even double-digit touchdowns. Was his dominance enough to make him the MVP of the fantasy world?
Well, he was certainly the MVP of my championship team. Having Travis Kelce was just an incredible advantage at the tight end position this year. I mean, we talk about how valuable running backs are, but you look at the tight end landscape, you basically had Travis Kelce and everybody else. I know Darren Waller had some good games in there, and TJ Hawkinson was nice from time to time. So was Mark Andrews. But on a week-to-week basis, Travis Kelce was just head and shoulders better than every other tight end. And it was an advantage that nobody else had at any other position. So I certainly think Travis Kelce absolutely deserves a nomination, and he even has a case for potentially being the MVP.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's very rare that we see a tight end that's that dominant. But let's look at the flip side. Now, of course, what matters the most is the fantasy playoffs. We'll talk a lot about that. Weeks 14 through 16, typically in most leagues. So he had some really good games, but not that breakout monster performance, right? He did score in each game, but only one of those was a 100-yard game. And Darren Waller was actually pretty close to him. He also had some monster games during the fantasy playoffs. Do you think that narrows the gap enough that kind of negates Kelce's dominance during most of the regular season?
Yeah, I mean, Darren Waller coming through in the fantasy playoffs with some huge games definitely narrowed the gap, but still, you're only talking about two guys at a position where in your league, you probably had to start one. So if you weren't one of the players with Darren Waller or Travis Kelce, chances are you were hurting. And then our second nominee, we're going to go with a running back, Alvin Kamara. No surprise here. Top scoring running back on the season. And, he had 6 touchdowns in the championship game. So, Pierre, what's the case for Alvin Kamara as the fantasy MVP?
Well, anybody who actually had Kamara in their league, I think that he's got their vote for sure. I mean, obviously that week 16 performance, that just caps off what was already a performance that made him the top scoring fantasy running back. Again, I mentioned guys like Cook and Henry, actually really close, but Kamara was so consistent with the scoring. Again, he didn't have those peaks and valleys, right? It wasn't like Derrick Henry would have a 200-yard game, a 3-touchdown game, and then have a dud mixed in here and there. I know that was rare, but still, Kamara was consistent in full PPR. You always knew what you were getting, several catches. So the consistency matters. And of course, what really matters is what he do when it counted the most. So Alvin Kamara's got a really strong case.
Yeah, it's hard to argue against Alvin Kamara, to be honest, but if there is an argument against them, there was that stretch there where Taysom Hill was under center and he wasn't really getting it done, and it definitely looked bad for teams. So if your team was fighting for a playoff spot at that point, you may not have made it, but it's hard to find a case against them. I mean, is there anything else you can think of to knock Alvin Kamara out of contention for MVP?
No, not really. It's really hard. You'd have to really be nitpicking to find something. But it is interesting to wonder, what if Drew Brees hadn't come back and we still had Taysom Hill at quarterback this last couple weeks? I wonder what it would have. Maybe things would have changed. We wouldn't have seen that 6-touchdown explosion, but I guess we'll never know. All right, and then our third nominee, let's go to the wide receiver position here. I'm sure you know who I'm going to talk about. It's Davante Adams. I mean, talk about touchdowns each and every week. He was scoring every single time out once he recovered from his injury. 15 touchdowns just since week 7. That's right, just since week 7. And of course, again, talking about that monster game when it counted most in week 16, that 3-touchdown game. So a really strong case, just like Michael Thomas was dominant in 2019. Davante Adams was that one wide receiver that you really wish maybe you had picked instead of that running back who got hurt or the other guy who disappointed, well, like Michael Thomas this year. So Adams was really by far and away the top receiver.
Yeah, and if not for missing those 2 games, he might have outscored Kamara. And honestly, he had a realistic shot at outscoring Kyler Murray, who was the overall top fantasy scorer for all positions. So he could have legitimately been the highest scoring fantasy player on the entire year. If you had Davante Adams, I mean, every week it was like the most stress-free player there was, right? It was like every single week you knew he was going to score touchdowns. You knew he was going to get targets. You knew he was going to get receptions. You knew he was going to pick up yards. It was just set him and forget him as much as it could be. He has a very, very strong case for MVP.
So the only case against I could think of is the fact that, well, at receiver, it's a little easier to get that same value, something comparable. Not that anybody was really close to Davante Adams, but it's easier to replace that position than at running back, right? It's just so hard to find that workhorse running back, that guy who's going to dominate. So the fact that he's a receiver, and he did miss a couple of games, whereas some of the other guys you mentioned haven't. So again, that's a very small detail there, but still, it's something worth noting. All right, guys, before we get to announcement of the actual MVP for 2020 fantasy football, all we ask is that you hit that subscribe button. If you find this video helpful, we would definitely appreciate it. And of course, click that little notification bell as well. All right, let's get to it. The MVP award for 2020 fantasy football, the endgame MVP is Alvin Kamara. No surprise there. I mean, it had to be Kamara, didn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I ran a poll on Twitter. I asked the same question, and Davante Adams won. But I think when you really look at it, it's Alvin Kamara. He was great all season long. I mean, so was Adams. But look at the fantasy playoffs. Kamara put up 20, 18, and then, of course, dropped the hammer in week 16 and basically ended your championship before it even began with 56. Adams was great in week 16, but didn't come close to 56. He also had a 20-point game, but that week 15 dud where he only got 11 fantasy points, that's enough for me to make the difference. I think it's absolutely Alvin Kamara. What do you think?
I have to agree. Sadly, didn't have much of him this year in any of my leagues, but absolutely, if you had him, that's definitely where your vote is going. I bet some of those people who didn't vote for him, it's because they lost to a team that had Alvin Kamara. That's probably what it was. Because, yeah, there's no way if you know his value, if you saw it, when it matters most, that's the guy who actually won your league. It was Kamara. And to me, I personally prefer having a running back anyways because there's just so much volatility at that position. All right, well, that is our fantasy football endgame MVP for 2020. Again, let's do this next year. We have a whole year to wait. Find out who's going to help win your league next year. Thanks so much for watching.